Welcome to the 453rd of the COVID calls. This is a daily discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. My name is Scott Gabriel Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters at the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. I'm coming to you live from Daejeon, South Korea. Today, I welcome actress and filmmaker Christa Rowe to talk about her new film, Promise House, Heather's Story. Just a reminder, you can catch COVID Calls live on Twitter and on the COVID Calls YouTube channel. You can hear COVID Calls anytime, recorded as podcasts on iTunes, Podbean, or anywhere you get podcasts. You can also keep up with COVID Calls via Twitter using the handle @US of Disaster or @COVID Calls. Please help spread the word and send suggestions for future guests and future topics. As always, please feel free to suggest yourself as a future guest, although please don't wait long. We'll be wrapping up the regular COVID calls and transitioning the project to a different kind of project after March 16th. So please get in touch with me before then. According to the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center, as of March 7th, 2022, 37,027 people have died from COVID-19 in Canada. In the United States, 958,621 people have died from COVID-19. I've been reading an obituary or a story of advocacy for those impacted by the pandemic. I'd like to continue that now. The headline is, "A rising death toll. Overdoses are increasing at a troubling rate." This was written by German Lopez, published February 13th, 2022, and appeared in the New York Times. Drug overdoses now kill more than 100,000 Americans a year, more than vehicle crash and gun deaths combined. Sean Blake was among those who died. He overdosed at age 27 in Vermont from a mix of alcohol and fentanyl, a synthetic opioid. He had struggled to find effective treatment for his addiction and other potential mental health problems, repeatedly relapsing. "I do love being sober," Blake wrote in 2014, 3 years before his death. "It's life that gets in the way," he wrote. Blake's struggles reflect the combination of problems that have allowed the overdose crisis to fester. First, the supply of opioids surged. Second, Americans have insufficient access to treatment and other programs that can ease the worst damage of drugs. Experts have a concise, if crude, way to summarize this. If it's easier to get high than to get treatment, people who are addicted will get high. The U.S. has effectively made it easy to get high and hard to get help. No other advanced nation is dealing with a comparable drug crisis, and over the past 2 years, it has worsened. Annual overdose deaths spiked 50% as fentanyl spread in illegal markets. More people turned to drugs during the pandemic, and treatment facilities and other services shut down. In the 1990s, drug companies promoted opioid painkillers as a solution to a problem that remains today, a need for better pain treatment. Purdue Pharma led the charge with OxyContin, claiming it was more effective and less addictive than it was. Doctors bought into the hype, and they started to more loosely prescribe opioids. Some even operated pill mills, so-called, trading prescriptions for cash. A growing number of people started to misuse the drugs, crushing or dissolving the pills to inhale or inject them. Many shared, stole, and sold opioids more widely. Policymakers and drug companies were slow to react. It wasn't until 2010 that Purdue introduced a new formulation that made its pills harder to misuse. The CDC didn't publish guidelines calling for tighter prescribing practices until 2 decades after OxyContin hit the market. In the meantime, the crisis deepened. Opioid users moved on to more potent drugs, namely heroin. Some were seeking a stronger high, while others were cut off from painkillers and looking for a replacement. Traffickers met that demand by flooding the U.S. with heroin. Then in the 2010s, they started to transition to fentanyl, mixing it into heroin and other drugs or selling it on its own. Drug cartels can more discreetly produce fentanyl in a lab than heroin derived from large, open poppy fields. Fentanyl is also more potent than heroin, so traffickers can smuggle less to sell the same high. Because of its potency, fentanyl is also more likely to cause an overdose. Since it began to proliferate in the United States, yearly overdose deaths have more than doubled. No one has a good answer for how to halt the spread of fentanyl. Synthetic drugs in general remain a major unsolved question, not just in the current opioid epidemic, but in dealing with future drug crises as well, Keith Humphreys, a Stanford University drug policy expert, said. A robust treatment system could have mitigated the damage from increasing supplies of painkillers, heroin, and fentanyl, but the United States has never had such a system. Treatment remains inaccessible for many. Sean Blake's parents, Kim and Tim, drained savings and retirement accounts and college funds to pay for treatment. Like the Blakes, many families spend thousands of dollars to try to get loved ones into care. Health insurers often refuse to pay for treatment. Legal requirements for insurance coverage are poorly enforced. When treatment is available, it's often of low quality. The Blakes frequently found that providers were ill-equipped and overwhelmed. Some seem to offer no evidence-based care at all. Across the country, most facilities don't offer effective medications. Instead, they often focus on unproven approaches like wilderness or equine therapy. Some are just scams. One called the Florida Shuffle has in recent years sent patients from facility to facility without offering real treatment, taking advantage of people desperate for help. Beyond treatment, the United States lags behind other countries in approaches like needle exchanges that focus on keeping people alive, ideally until they're ready to stop using drugs. The country also could do more to prevent drug use and address root causes of addiction, a recent report from Stanford University and The Lancet found. The solutions are costly. A plan that President Biden released on the campaign trail, which experts praised, would cost $125 billion over 10 years. That's far more than Congress has committed to the crisis. Lawmakers haven't taken up Biden's plan, and the White House hasn't pushed for it, so far embracing smaller steps, but inaction carries a price too. Overdose deaths cost the economy $1 trillion a year in health expenses, reduced productivity, and other losses, a new government report concluded, equivalent to nearly half of America's economic growth last year. The story was a rising death toll. Overdoses are increasing at a troubling rate, appeared in the New York Times, February 13th of this year. Okay, I'd like to turn to the conversation for today, and I've really been looking forward to this conversation. Let me introduce my guest, Christa Rowe. Originally from Arlington, Texas, Christa Rowe is an independent filmmaker, producer, director, and actress. She produced 3 seasons of the reality road trip cooking show American Food Battle with Helsinki-based Mogul Media for the AWE network and National Geographic Channel. She also produced Amanda and the Players, a hockey reality series for Mogul Media. She works as a commercial, television, and film actress in Canada. Her first documentary film, Promise House, Heather's Story, was selected for an award of merit at the Impact Doc Awards, and she was named Best Canadian Female Filmmaker at the Toronto International Women's Film Festival. She holds a bachelor's degree in theater arts from Texas Christian University and a master's in international education from New York University, and is the founder of 3LG Productions. She lives in Toronto with her husband, 3 daughters, and Peggy, the schnoodle dog, who we might even see at some point during this conversation. Christa Rowe, welcome to COVID Calls.
Hi, Scott. Thank you for having me.
So I'd like to start the way I usually do, find out where you're calling from and what the pandemic situation looks like there today.
Sure. I'm in Toronto. Toronto has been locked down during COVID over the past 2 years, more than any other city in North America, as you may know. So it's definitely been a challenging couple of years here, especially I have, 3 daughters. They're all teen and preteen age, 15, 13, and 11. So it's been a difficult time for everyone to be home and at those, ages where your friends and your social interactions are the most critical and important things in your life. Having that taken away, I think has been really developmentally stunting for them in many ways, but things are looking up. Regulations are, relaxing, and we're hopefully on the road to get back to normal. We're nowhere near what things are like in the States. We still have a very strict mask mandate. Um, you know, but we are like getting back to being able to eat in restaurants and social gatherings and things like that. So that's kind of
Do the schools have a consistent set of policies, or would you find yourself sort of like constantly trying to keep up with, we're back, we're not back, we're modified hours, things like that?
right. Well, I mean, I can only speak for, in Toronto. So the Toronto District School Board, the TDSB, has some blanket policies as far as like mask mandates. Vaccine mandates are left to each individual school. The school that my daughters go to, they go to an all-girls school and they have a vaccine mandate. But, I mean, all the schools basically always follow the same procedures in the event of going virtual or being in person. So my girls went virtual in March of 2020. In Toronto, we have what's called March break, spring break in the US. They got out for March break in March of 2020, and they did not go back at all for the entire school year. They did go back in September, and they lasted in person until they broke for the winter holiday in December. Then they were out until mid-February. They went back for about a month. And then by the Easter break, they were out again, virtual for the rest of the year.
I wonder about Texas during this time too. You and I are going to talk. Full disclosure, you and I went to high school together. We know a lot of people in common.
Yes,
And
we've known each other for over 30 years.
and happy to say that. But it's been hard for me sometimes to take the news coming out of Texas. I mean, I'm in South Korea, you're in Canada. These are both countries that have managed the pandemic in what you might describe as pretty aggressive ways. And then to watch what's been going on back home has been hard for me.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. I mean, and it's frustrating for my children too, because my kids are friends with a lot of our friends' kids, and they'll text or, Snapchat or whatever it is, and they're back in school. And my kids feel like that's really unfair because they wanted, to go back to school. But then, their COVID rates were outrageous. And it's a huge push-pull as a parent. You want them to go to school, but you don't want them to obviously get sick. So
I've been asking guests to share a memory of the pandemic. It's the impossible question because of the so many things that we've been through and so many phases of this. But do you have something that really stands in for you for this time?
Well, my pandemic experience was further complicated by the fact that I was also managing my mother's Alzheimer's disease during this time. And when the pandemic started, my parents were living in Texas, still in their own home. And my mother was sort of at a critical phase in her disease where she was getting much worse. And the need for help was becoming, more on a daily basis. And that wasn't something that they really felt, or my father really felt comfortable with at the beginning of the pandemic, because, having healthcare workers into the house, obviously the rates of COVID in Texas were just through the roof. They're both elderly. And so there was a lot of fear, and my mother was getting sicker and sicker, and it was becoming a really untenable situation. The border was closed. I couldn't get home to them. It was a really complicated situation. So we ended up in August bringing my parents up to Toronto. We had to get an attorney, an immigration attorney that got them what's called a family reunification visa. And they were able to come up to Toronto, and I ended up finding a small rental house that is near where we lived, and we got them moved into there, and we got 7 days a week care for my mother. But that was a really, really complicated time. And we finally kind of got things settled in that situation. And then as my mom proceeded to get worse and worse, that became untenable. And so then we had to move her into a nursing home, a nursing facility here in Toronto. And that was about a year ago. It was actually on April 7th, because I remember that so distinctly, because the day we moved my mother into the nursing home, my youngest daughter, we found out had COVID. So that was obviously, I had had at that point one vaccine, because Canada was quite late getting the vaccine, and there was vaccine shortage, and they were doing vaccines at 16-week intervals for Pfizer rather than the 3-week interval. So I had had one. My other two daughters were obviously not vaccinated at the time. We had just moved my mother into a nursing home. My father also had only had one vaccine. It was a little bit of a panic time. Fortunately, she's 11. She wasn't sick, but she did have to spend 10 days in the guest room alone. So that was also really difficult. And at first, she was scared. Obviously, we were all scared. But then after 72 hours, then she was bored, and then she was naughty. And then she started to enjoy it a little bit, I think, having me, she would text me, I need a snack. I would like some strawberries, but please make sure you cut the tops. It's like,
Of course.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's for me, in addition to just, oh my gosh, at times just feeling like I was losing my mind, and, researching how to freeze eggs, because we thought, oh, we were all going to, not have enough food, and,
Yeah.
you know, wiping down the groceries. And we had segregated areas of our basement where we would bring the groceries in, and everything that didn't have to be refrigerated would stay in quarantine in the basement for 2 days. And anything that had to immediately come up to the kitchen to be refrigerated had to be, Lysol wiped. And we were doing the same thing that everybody else was doing around the world. But yeah, it was definitely complicated by my mom's dementia and Alzheimer's. And that was, obviously very complicated, because she doesn't understand what's going on. She doesn't understand that we're in a pandemic. And so that was, yeah, I would say that was my biggest challenge. That's definitely a COVID memory.
Well, I mean, just with what you just described, you're like actively managing, keeping track of the health status of 7 people, if you include your parents and your family.
Mhm.
And then layer in 2 moves across international boundaries. I mean, it's a lot, Chris.
Yeah. Yeah. It was a time in my life that I do not ever want to repeat.
Well, I'm glad you got them there. It's safer
Yes.
for them there, no doubt.
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
And, now that things are smoothed out, obviously my mom is a different story, but now my father, he is living in a house that is 4 doors down from ours. And so in many ways,
That's
I
great.
mean, how many times in your life is your grandfather going to live 4 doors down? And, he's actually been really helpful at the time in my life for my kids' needs. For a babysitter, all they need is someone with a driver's license and who's willing, and he has that, and he's willing. So, yeah, in that way, it's helpful, and I think it's good for him. He's very useful. So,
I want to just remind folks you're listening to COVID Calls, and I'm talking today to filmmaker Christa Rowe, and catching up on her life and the pandemic situation in Canada. And let's turn to talking about this film that you've made. It's an extraordinary film. Everyone should see this film when it gets into wider, wider release. Promise House, Heather's story. And I'm going to show the trailer for it here in a moment. But I mean, let's just start with this. Who's it about, and why did you make this film?
sure. So, growing up in Texas, my closest friend through high school was a woman named Heather Clampett. And, we had one of those very best friend, girlfriend, high school relationships that is very intense. People of a certain generation, understand. I guess anyone understands that kind of intense friendship when you're in high school. You share a locker, you meet up between each class, you go to school together, you do extracurriculars together, you go home, you get on the phone, you talk for 3 hours about, what boy talked to you in between classes and what you're going to wear to school the next day. So that was Heather for me. And then after school, we both went off to college, university. She has a master's degree in English. She was brilliant. And through sort of an unfortunate turn of events, and certainly some family history and genetics, Heather suffered from a lot of mental illness, depression, anxiety, and then it became compounded with prescription drug abuse, uh, which became, sort of this snowball effect. And anyways, we reconnected. She had kind of fallen off the grid, if you will. And we reconnected. And at that time, I was very interested in trying my hand at producing and directing my own documentary film. I'd worked on some others and in some reality TV. And I thought, this is a great story. We need to share your story. And, I kind of pitched her the idea and she came on board with it. And we had this idea that we would tell her story. And then, she was in recovery. And the idea was that we would kind of have this happy ending and that she would be able to use this film and we would use this film for education. And, we talked a lot of big things that she could go to schools and, we would show the film and then she could do question and answer and she would help other people, that were maybe suffering from myriad of mental illnesses or drug addiction. And that was sort of how we envisioned the project ending. It did not end that way. I guess it's not, untoward to say, unfortunately, Heather relapsed. She became quite sick again, and she died by suicide 3 years ago. So that obviously changed the trajectory of the project for me, but I finished the film and sort of as a way to honor her. And so that's kind of where we're at now. It was a very long project. We shot it over 2 years. Then it took, almost 4 years in editing because my family moved from, the US to Canada, then throw in a global pandemic and, 3 children that were small at the beginning of the project and are now into their teen years. So, it was a very long project, but it's finished now.
Why don't I, and why don't I show the trailer and then we can talk about some of the issues that are raised in it, because you didn't make the film. I mean, this project, as you said, was started before COVID, before we knew anything about COVID. But so many of the issues here that are raised, and like the New York Times story I read at the top of the program, these are issues which have been compounded by COVID. And so, I mean, it was relevant before, and now, I mean, all of the problems that you were just describing that Heather went through have been made even much worse in the last 2 years. So let me just bring up the clip here, and we'll watch that, and then we'll talk some more about it. Bear with me 1 second here.
Hello, I'm Heather. There is a growing grassroots awareness about
the potential for these medications to induce potential permanent damage?
I have an awful lot of medications. But the main ones are lithium and Seroquel.
I take propranolol at nighttime. I take Ativan at nighttime to help me sleep.
He had me on OxyContin again, and oxycodone, and Valium, and muscle relaxers, and Ambien, and all sorts of stuff.
I can't remember all the medications that I take.
I find it amazing that somebody who has ingested the number of drugs she has, and I mean prescription legal drugs, over, let's say, the last 10 years, that she can make complete sentences.
She's on pain pills. She's addicted to pain pills.
Who is actually mentally ill versus who are the selfish drug addicts that are always the victims and unaccountable for anything, that we're just looking to perhaps get on government benefits or something.
Had my arm multiple times with like a mirror I found that I hid. I swallowed a battery. All I want to do is live. Yeah.
Put a mirror on the wall, taped his driver's license to his chest, wrapped a comforter around him, and I guess put the shotgun in his mouth and pulled the trigger.
So one of the things about this is the trailer for Promise House, Heather's Story, the new film that was directed, produced by Christa Rowe, my guest today. And of course, I knew Heather and knew all the places that you show in this film, so it's hard to watch. It's powerfully, the images are really powerful. But I wanted to ask you about the place that she lived through much of the much of the story that you're telling here. She was living in and out of, I guess you call them boarding houses.
Yeah. So I was a little confused about that at first. What exactly is a boarding home? And it's not, because I think a lot of people, and I thought too, that it was sort of a transitional housing that is sometimes, and oftentimes, I think after people are released from some sort of correctional facility, prison or jail. And it's not that, it's not a halfway house either. A boarding home in Texas, it's mandated, it's regulated by the state of Texas. And people that become boarding home owners, they have to get licensed. There's a lot of abuse in the system, as is touched on in the movie a little bit. But the particular boarding house that Heather lived in, most of the residents there claimed that it was a good place to live. There was a lot of issues, obviously, both interpersonal and, with the woman who owned this particular boarding home. And then, there was some hygiene issues, bed bugs, things like that. Right. But for the most part, the women that lived there were treated with respect. It was all women that lived at this particular home. And they were mostly women who were suffering from mental illness and, and or drug addiction, both. It was an interesting experience to be there and to film there and to spend the amount of time there that I did, because there was a lot of love between the women. They cared about each other. Yeah. They took care of one another. And certainly, it showed that these issues cross all racial and ethnic and socioeconomic, even really, boundaries. We think a lot of these as places that people, who live or are raised in poverty end up. And that certainly was not the case for Heather. If there's any stereotype about the type of person who might end up here, she debunks that stereotype. Raised upper middle class suburban neighborhood, and with all the privilege that we enjoyed in that, and very well educated, well spoken, beautiful. I mean, all of the things that we are told give us the advantage, and that society does give us the advantage because of, she had, and yet, it couldn't save her from, powerful opioids and mental illness.
There's a scene in there where the manager of Promise House, who I guess you got pretty close with too, because there's a real rapport. I mean, she really talks. I mean, she really explains the situation in a way, and you use the convention of going back and forth between her and then experts. And I like the experts, but I was like, where's she again?
Yeah, she's compelling. Yeah, she's very compelling.
What's her name again?
Her name is, they all called her Miss Tammy. Her name is Tammy Neal.
I'm like, I want Miss Tammy back on screen, because I was really riveted when she was talking. There's a scene where she shows you the drugs.
Oh my God, I know, right? Bags of drugs.
Bags full of prescription medication. And you go through, and there's a part, I don't want to give too much away the film. There's a part in which the people who are living there talk to you very openly about the drugs they're on. Mm-hmm. Prescribed drugs.
Every one of them.
And you, at that point in the film, I kind of had to stop myself. I was like, is this a film about mental illness, or is this a film about drug addiction in America? And I ask you that question, but it's yes. I mean, it became indistinguishable to me how the story of Heather and the women that she's there with, it's a cycle of mental health, and the problem of getting mental health treatment and drug addiction from prescribed drugs and opioids, but well beyond that. I mean, many other kinds of mood stabilizers and heart medications and all sorts of things that is pointed out in the film. We might know what they do individually, but compounded and in quantity over duration of time, I just felt like you were showing us something these people are going through, an experiment almost of sorts.
Yeah. I mean, Heather even says that at one point. She says that her brain feels like an apothecary shop, and it's witchcraft trying to figure out, how to deal with, these medications. And then, as you said, the side effects from the medications, and then the medications that are prescribed to deal with the side effects from the first medication. It's like this horrific snowball effect.
How do you think Heather would have done? So she died before the pandemic started, about a year, almost exactly, since it really kicked off in the United States. And this has been a terrible time for people dealing with both mental health challenges and drug addiction in the United States. How do you think she would have coped with it?
Oh God, that is such a good question. And part of me says, there's no way she would have survived. You take into account, every risk factor, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, congregate living settings, poor health, obesity, all of these things that were these huge risk factors. But interestingly enough, I actually talked to Miss Tammy not too long ago, maybe about 3 weeks ago.
Really?
And with the exception of Marcia, who is one of the women that you do see in the trailer, they all are still alive. They all survived the pandemic. And I don't know. And then, so you think, well, maybe because they did live very isolated lifestyle. They were I'm assuming they probably just formed their own bubble and never left, because they weren't really leaving much beforehand other than to go to doctor's appointments. Because, they lived in South Dallas and none of them had cars. So anybody who's at all familiar with that part of the country, if you don't have a car, you're not really doing much of anything, And most everyone was living on disability. there was nobody living at the house that was leaving daily to go to work in any capacity. So, it's an interesting question, because they were so isolated before the pandemic. So it's hard to know. Would it, have just been one other thing that was happening outside the walls of the Promise House that they were watching on the news? How would it have affected them? But I mean, I don't know. It's a great question, and I don't know. And because Heather also, with me at least, our relationship would sort of go in and out depending on how she was doing mentally. And, so we would have periods of time where we would, text and, talk daily, sometimes, like a text thread that would go on all day. And then, I wouldn't hear from her for 3 or 4 weeks. And, I'd reach out and not get anything back. And then she'd sort of come back and she'd be like,
Yeah.
well, I've been sick, or, I was in the hospital and this and that. So, it could have gone either way. It could have been a time that she reached out and been very close, or, a withdrawal from communication.
One of the things that I loved about Heather is that she was a real writer, and she processed the world through words, and she kept journals, voluminous journals, and she made mixtapes, and people have to be Gen X or older maybe to know what that is, but she was a great creator of mixtapes. And so her life, she narrated her life, and it had a soundtrack.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And I wanted to ask you about that in terms of making this film about your friend.
Yeah.
And I'm asking this for a reason, because we are living in a period of time where we have never seen so much loss in such a short period of time. So many people that we've had to say goodbye to. And this is people who've died of COVID, or this is people who've died of other things in the midst of COVID, deferred treatment, or just they just passed away, and COVID was the context.
Mm-hmm.
And so, here in this case, you took the opportunity to tell her life story in a powerful way. But to do it, you had to, there's discontinuities, as you just said. You can't tell the whole story. You have photographs. You're putting together. I mean, I guess I'm asking you to give up your secrets how you made this film. But I just like, how do you put together a narrative of a person with so much complexity in her life, in the midst of this sort of national crisis of mental health and drug addiction? So when you went to start to stitch it together as a narrative, how did you think about that? How did you start that?
Well, it's interesting because you said when you were watching it, you were like, what is this film about? Is this about drug addiction? Is this about, and I asked myself that all the time. We kind of went and we filmed over a period of 2 years, and it was very, sort of run and gun style, if you will. And, we had a lot of interviews that we did with various people in Heather's life, and then, the other residents that live at the Promise House. And at the end of it, I mean, I probably had close to 200 hours of footage. And that was my question too. Like, what is this about? Is this about the opioid crisis? Is this about mental health? Is this about the, lack of good quality care, medical care in the United States for mental illness? Do I want to spin this as, why don't we look at people that are suffering from depression or schizoaffective disorder in the same way as people who are suffering from, cancer or diabetes,
Right.
And ultimately, I guess, I had a really good editor that helped me. That helps a lot. Garth Smith, who was amazing. But, and we sat down and we talked, for hours about this. And we finally decided that the best way that we could distill this down was to tell it as one woman's story. Right. And to try and make it as simple as possible, and let it just be her story. And when we first started editing it, Heather was still with us, and so I would even talk with her about some of the decisions that we were making about, and she was, as you said, she was a prolific writer. She was a brilliant woman, and she wrote, well, she left all the instructions for her funeral of how that was supposed to go. And when she asked that I deliver her eulogy, she instructed me to make it funny, and so I do feel like she had a voice in this. And the music, the original music, is by, Society of Broken Souls, who is a friend of ours, and actually, an ex-relationship of Heather's, and still a friend of Heather's for her whole life. So, in that way, it felt a little bit like a family effort to put this together to honor her. I think she would have been happy with the music. As you said, music was super important. She did have a soundtrack to her life for sure. So I hope I did a good job of honoring her in that way. She did, when we were working on it, she made one request of me. She said, if we have to narrate this story to move it along, she said, you have to narrate it. Which is why the movie doesn't have narration.
You didn't want to do that.
I didn't, because I felt like if I narrated it, it would be somehow my retelling of her story, and I wanted it to be her telling her story.
Yeah.
So, maybe in hindsight, we could have, stitched the narrative together in a better flow if there had been narration. But
no, I don't think it needs it. I mean, and you give her a lot of, she does narrate it. I mean, her voice comes through, and the voice of her brother and her aunt. And it's a powerful document about loss. And I think, when I was talking before, it's about these many things. I mean, that's to me a huge strength of this, because if you had said, this is a film about mental illness, or this is a film about drug addiction, and we're going to have films like this that are going to be about COVID.
Yeah.
I think they do a disservice to the density of human emotion and complication that's involved in this. So even just the way her brother, and I wanted to ask you about her brother's role in this, his tone of voice changes at various moments throughout the film too. I mean, we see him going through something here. I mean, both of his parents have died. His father's died by suicide. His mother's died by drug overdose.
Yeah.
And his sister has died as well. And he does a good job, I think, trying in some ways to give some context for all of it.
Yeah.
But it's incredibly hard that part for me was the hardest part to watch, him trying to make sense of that. But that voice and the tone of the voice is, again, I think that's something we have grappled with a lot in these last 2 years too. Just we can't hear from COVID victims, so we have to hear from their families and their caregivers.
Yeah.
And it's hard to listen to.
Yeah. Well, and all these things are, it's so, the emotions are so complex, of loving someone, but being so angry with them, and, wanting them to get better, and wanting them to, get their act together, and then feeling for them when they can't, but then being angry with them. It's interesting. I was talking to someone today, about my mother having Alzheimer's disease, and it's the same thing. It's so complicated. And then, you want them to be who they were, but they're not. And it's upsetting and frustrating, and it makes you angry, and then it makes you guilty. And, but I guess that's being human, right? That's very complex emotions.
You mentioned the music, and I wanted to take a moment to linger on that. That's because some of the music is by, I guess all of it is by the band Society of Broken Souls. And as you mentioned, the songwriter is somebody that we knew growing up. He's a tremendously gifted songwriter and performer. Were these songs that they had already written, or was some of this music made specifically
No,
What-
he basically opened his entire musical oeuvre to me and said, "You can choose
Wow,
any songs that you want." And,
that's really
he's yeah. And, I mean, like you said, uh, Dennis is an amazing songwriter and performer. And, he lived in Texas. He doesn't live in Texas anymore, but he lived in Texas for many, many years and captures that feel, which is very it's also a very sort of Texas story, in a lot of ways.
Let me ask you about that. And people who are from Texas, particularly that part of Texas, will understand when you have a sequence of shots where you go from a longhorn steer and an oil derrick to a highway seemingly without end, strip mall, and then the suburban house. Those may seem disjointed in some ways. I mean, I think that you did a great job putting it all together, but I mean, it's an interesting juxtaposition of scenes. But for somebody who's from that part of Texas, I was home when I watched this.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, totally. I mean, like you said, for, people who live here in Canada, they might be like, "Really?" But you're absolutely right. That's
Oil derrick, like
yeah.
backyard.
Yeah. The Barnett Shale. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, maybe actually, yeah, seeing a longhorn, as you're driving down a 6-lane freeway at, 85 miles an hour as the posted speed limit. Yeah.
But it's also, I mean, I think that was a really important point of the film too, because a lot of this, the anguish, the mental health suffering, the drug addiction, and then Heather's time in the boarding, this takes place in the home.
Mhm.
And I wonder what you think about that. I mean, because it is a statement also maybe about this problem of, do we have the facilities that people need? Do we have the drug treatment facilities? Do we have the halfway houses, the mental health facilities? I mean, I was stunned to see the interiors of so many homes where so much suffering had taken place. And it's like, well, this is also where the treatment takes place.
Yeah.
I'm surprised by that.
Well, it's interesting because the state of Texas is really one of the only states in the US, as I understand, and I'm not an expert in mental health at all. I'm just one, little documentary filmmaker that told one little story. But Texas is really one of the only states that still actually has mental health hospitals, like the Texas State Mental Hospital at Terrell, which is where Heather spent 2 different stays, both of them about 9 months. So she spent a lot of time at Terrell State, Institute. And we were lucky enough, we actually got to go there one day and filmed a tremendous amount of footage. And that's the heartbreak in documentary film. There's so much good footage, but it just doesn't fit into your narrative in a way that works. But we were able to, have a comprehensive tour of Terrell. And it was one of the most exhausting days of filming of my entire life, even though we just sort of walked around. They let us go into one of the wards, and there was, patients that were living there, and seeing the rooms that they were living in, and, sort of those plastic mattresses made up with sheets that, are stamped state of Texas on them. And to think that, she lived there for 9 months, 2 different times, and, she talked to me a lot about the dangers of that, because she would say, I've become institutionalized. It's hard for me to make decisions for myself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so then you go into these small boarding homes, and that is where the care and the treatment, but there's one scene in it where one of the women who lives there, who Miss Tammy deems is doing good, has been given the job of handing out meds.
Right.
Which to me was absolutely shocking, because, it wasn't being administered by a nurse or a medical assistant. And these are drugs, it's not just Seroquel or lithium. I mean, this is Tylenol 3. This is codeine that,
Right.
that another, resident, sorry, there goes the dog, is dispensing to their peers, Sorry.
That's fine. I'll take this moment just to remind folks that you're listening to COVID Calls and talking today with Christa Rowe, who's the director of the new film Promise House, Heather's Story. And we're almost out of time. I wanted to get to one more question before we. So thank you for making this film. And for those of us who loved, for those of us who loved Heather, who love Heather, this is a really powerful way to cope with that loss. So you've really made something extraordinary. But I think this film is going to start a lot of conversations, and I think it's going to help a lot of people. And I really want people to watch it.
Well, thank you. I hope so.
And I think they will. And congratulations on winning the award. And I think there will be more awards to follow. But this is heavy, and that's a vast understatement. And when I think of you, I think of laughter. And so I wanted to sort of finish maybe just by asking you, in the middle of this, and this is, again, this time that we're living through, this one big concrete block of loss that we're all just dealing with right now, where did you find humor, not in this subject material, but and even with Heather while dealing with it, did you find moments to laugh? Did you find things? Because when I picture you both together, I picture there's a lot of laughs.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we had fun when we were doing this. Yes, the topics were heavy. The interviews were heavy. Heather also, she was kind of a night owl. And so this one interview that we did with her, she didn't even want to start till, we started at like 8 o'clock. And by the time we set up all the equipment, we were talking until, 1, 2 in the morning, rolling the film. The poor cinematographer, Marco, was falling asleep behind the camera, but, yeah, we had fun. And, we'd hop in the car and, find Depeche Mode on, the whatever, Sirius first wave station. And I mean, in many ways, we'd, drive around with the windows rolled down and sing along. And it's sort of like reliving a little bit of our youth, but, I mean, it's interesting that you say that because, other people that I've talked about with this or I've seen it, they're like, this is the kind of work that you do, because I am sort of a, silly personality. And yeah, I mean, I got 3 kids and, you just keeps things light, so.
Yeah. Well, let me just remind folks you've been listening to COVID Calls, and you can usually catch COVID Calls live at 7 p.m. Eastern time. Although these days, as we're leading up to March 16th, we're doing kind of around the clock. So keep up by following at US of Disaster, and you can find out when COVID Calls will be taking place. And I want to thank my guest today, Christa Rowe, who's produced this new film, Promise House, Heather's Story. I'm proud to know you. This is phenomenal. And thanks for coming on today and talking. It's great to see you.
Oh, thank you. It was my pleasure. It was an honor to spend some time with you again.
Stay healthy, everybody. We'll see you next time on COVID Calls.